A brief history of the Philippines. The Philippines is named after King Philip II of Spain, 1556 to 1598, and it was a Spanish colony for over 300 years. Today, the Philippines is an archipelago of 7,000 islands. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan sailed across the Pacific. He landed in the Philippines and claimed them for Spain. Magellan baptized a chief called Humaban and hoped to make him a puppet ruler on behalf of the Spanish crown. Magellan demanded that other chiefs submit to Humaban, but one chief named Lapu-Lapu refused. Magellan led a force to crush him. However, the Spanish soldiers were scattered and Magellan was killed. The Spaniards did not gain a foothold in the Philippines until 1565, when Miguel Lopez de Legazpi led an expedition which built a fort in Cebu. Later, in 1571, the Spaniards landed in Luzon. Here they built the city of Intramuros, later called Manila, which became the capital of the Philippines. Spanish conquistadors marched inland and conquered Luzon. They created a feudal system. Spaniards owned vast estates worked by Filipinos. Along with the conquistadors went friars, who converted the Filipinos to Catholicism. The friars also built schools and universities. The Spanish colony in the Philippines brought prosperity, for the upper class anyway. Each year, the Chinese exported goods such as silk, porcelain, and lacquer to the Philippines. The years passed uneventfully in the Philippines until 1762, the British captured Manila. They held it for 2 years, but they handed it back in 1764 under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763. In 1872, there was a rebellion in Cavite, but it was quickly crushed. However, nationalist feeling continued to grow, helped by a writer named Jose Rizal, 1861 to 1896. He wrote 2 novels, Noli Me Tangere, Touch Me Not, and El Filibusterismo, the filibusterer, which stoked the fires of nationalism. In 1892, Jose Rizal found a movement called Liga Filipina, which called for reform rather than revolution. As a result, Rizal was arrested and exiled to Dapitan on Mindanao. Meanwhile, Andres Bonifacio formed a more extreme organization called the Katipunan in August 1896. They began a revolution. Jose Rizal was accused of supporting the revolution, although he did not, and he was executed on 30 December 1896. Yet his execution merely inflamed Filipino opinion, and the revolution grew. On April 30th, 1898, the Americans defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. Meanwhile, Filipino revolutionaries had surrounded Manila. Their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, declared the Philippines independent on 12 June. However, as part of the peace treaty, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States. The Americans planned to take over. War between American forces in Manila and the Filipinos began on 4 February 1899. The Filipino-American War lasted until 1902, when Aguinaldo was captured. American rule in the Philippines was paternalistic. They called their policy benevolent assimilation. They wanted to Americanize the Filipinos, but they never quite succeeded. However, they did do something good. Many American teachers were sent to the Philippines in a ship called the Taurus, and they did increase literacy. In 1935, the Philippines were made a commonwealth and were semi-independent. Manuel Quezon became president. The United States promised that the Philippines would become completely independent in 1945. However, in 7 December 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. On 10 December 1941, Japanese troops invaded the Philippines. They captured Manila on 2 January 1942. By 6 May 1942, all of the Philippines were in Japanese hands. However, American troops returned to the Philippines in October 1944. Including General Douglas MacArthur. They recaptured Manila in February of 1945. the Philippines became independent on 4 July 1946. Manuel Rojas was the first president of the newly independent nation. Ferdinand Marcos, from 1917 to 1989, was elected president in 1965. He was re-elected in 1969. However, the Philippines was dogged by poverty and inequality. In the 1960s, a land reform program began. Many peasants were frustrated by its slow progress, and a communist insurgency began in the countryside. On 21 September 1972, Marcos declared martial law. He imposed a curfew, suspended Congress, and arrested opposition leaders. The Marcos dictatorship was exceedingly corrupt, and Marcos and his cronies enriched themselves. Then, in 1980, opposition leader Benigno Aquino went into exile in the United States. When he returned on 21 August 1983, he was shot. Aquino became a martyr, and Filipinos were enraged by his murder. In February 1986, Marcos called an election. The opposition united behind Cory Aquino, the widow of Benigno. Marcos claimed victory, a clear case of electoral fraud. Cory Aquino also claimed victory, and ordinary people took to the streets to show their support for her. The followers of Marcos deserted him, and he bowed to the inevitable and went into exile. Things did not go more smoothly for Corazon Aquino. She survived 7 coup attempts. Furthermore, the American bases in the Philippines, Subic Bay Naval Base and Clark Air Base, were unpopular with many Filipinos who felt they should go. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted and covered Clark in volcanic ash, forcing the Americans to leave. They left Subic Bay in 1992. In 1992, Fidel Ramos became president. He improved the infrastructure in the Philippines, including the electricity supply. Industry was privatized, and the economy began to grow more rapidly. However, at the end of the 1990s, the Philippine economy entered a crisis. Meanwhile, in 1998, Joseph Estrada, known as ERAP, became president. Estrada was accused of corruption. He was impeached, in November of 2000. Estrada was not convicted. Nevertheless, people demonstrated against him, and the military withdrew its support. Estrada was forced to leave the office, and Vice President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo replaced him. She was re-elected in 2004. Today, the Philippines is still poor, but things are changing. Since 2010, the Philippine economy has grown at about 6% a year. Meanwhile, in 2016, the Philippines launched its first satellite. It was called Diwata No. 1. In 2020, the population of the Philippines was 106 million people. That's just a brief history of the Philippines. Thanks for watching.